Hey y'all, this is Sonya with Solminod. We'd like to welcome you all here today. We are in Des Moines, Iowa. It is a lovely day here in August after a sweltering July. And we have a special guest with us here, Charity Lee, and she is the founder and head of the Ella Foundation. She has lived a fascinating life, and she is here to speak about it today and a little bit about the great work that she does, both for victims of violent crimes and also for those who are incarcerated and quite often treated so inhumanely. So, Charity Lee, I'd like to welcome you to Solminod.
Thank you for having me.
Glad that you're here. So, I detect a little bit of a twang. Where are you from?
Originally from Georgia, and I've been based in Texas for the last 7 years.
Now, so first of all, let's talk a little bit about your background. You were a victim of a violent crime as a family member because of a murder that took place in your family. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Which one?
The first, when you were young.
The first one. Okay, so when I was 6 years old, which would have been 1980, my father was essentially executed in our home early one morning. It happened in March of 1980, and by July of 1980, my mother had been arrested, charged, tried, gone to trial, and acquitted of murder for hire.
Murder for hire. And how old were you at this time?
6.
6-year-old little girl. How do you begin to wrap your little mind around such a devastating act of violence?
Well, at the time, I don't recall necessarily being aware that everything that was going on was going on. At the time, what I knew was that my father was dead. And I can't even say with certainty that I knew how or why, just that he was dead. Like, I can't remember if anybody told me he was murdered or he just died. And then the second thing I knew with certainty was that I couldn't see my mom for a while. And
So who are you staying with?
I stayed with my maternal grandparents, yes, and my mom's sister for just a little bit, but mostly my maternal grandparents.
And were there any other siblings in the home?
No, it was just me. I have a half brother, but he wasn't there. He didn't live with us. It wasn't until later, about second grade, that the whole, your father was murdered, your mother did it, your mother's a murderer, we don't want to talk to you, your mom's a murderer, started happening. So
The children in the schools, your peer group, even their parents, some of the adults perhaps?
the parents, I know there's parents that are like this, but fortunately the parents weren't like that with me. Now, the parents kept a very wide berth. They did not interact with my mother. And I grew up, privileged, always went to private schools. These were, very upwardly mobile, class-based people.
Sure.
And it didn't matter, no matter how much money my mother subsequently made or how, successful she was, that always hung over her head.
Right.
She was never socially accepted. On the other hand, I don't think she really wanted to be. But as for me as a child, it was very difficult because you want to fit in.
Of course.
And, I had this mother that nobody really wanted to talk to, and I knew that everybody talked about us behind our backs. And, little girls especially can be quite vicious sometimes.
Sure.
And how, you get into these little schoolgirl fights. Well, that was always what they would use as their ammunition. Well, your mom murdered your dad, so it was a constant presence in my life.
How were you able to overcome this?
I'll let you know when I do that.
It is a process.
It wasn't until recently, actually, that after the second murder in my family occurred, that here in the last year, I decided that I needed to know more about that case. And a lot of the advocacy work I do, when I first started doing it, I never mentioned the fact that my father was murdered. And another colleague of mine was like, Charity, why don't you ever tell that story? That's as much a part of who you are as this second murder.
And very relatable to many, I'm sure.
And very relatable. So why don't you talk about it? And I was like, because I guess in up until recently, it was just kind of a normal fact of my life. Series of events, have led me to decide that I needed to research it myself. And I recently spent 3 weeks back in Georgia, in Atlanta, where I'm from, and I spoke to the DA that prosecuted my mother. I spoke to the investigators that compiled the evidence to charge her with murder. I tried speaking to her attorneys. I knew they wouldn't talk to me, especially one of them who went on to become the governor of Georgia with my mother's campaign contribution help. And I'm firmly convinced now, and it is my opinion, that my mother did have my father murdered when I was 6.
And was there excessive fighting or infidelity or violence in the home?
There was no violence, according to what the detectives told me, and my mother has said over the years that he was not a violent man, physically. I do know that he was he was a, what do the kids call him now? He was a playa. He was a playa.
He was unfaithful to your mother, and she must have caught wind of this then?
Well, no, it was a bit more complicated than that. My mother knew that my father had women. She paid for their apartments and paid their bills. And I really think, okay, so when my parents first met, my father was very hardworking. Now he was a criminal. Don't get me wrong. He was a criminal. They were into chop shops and moved into drug trafficking. They used our trucks. We had a trucking.
And are you in relationship with your mother today?
I do not speak to my mother anymore.
When was the last time you spoke to your mother?
I tried to visit not too long ago at the beginning of the year. It never goes well. Since
But she was acquitted. She's out of prison, correct?
she was acquitted, she was never. I mean, she did serve. I mean, she didn't serve time, but she was held briefly until she could convince the judge to let her post bond. So I mean, she got away with it.
Charity, I thank you for taking the time to share a little bit more about that and so in depth. I'm sure that still today is very uncomfortable for you. We're going to take just a brief break, and when we come back, we are going to transition to years forward to continue to talk about Charity Lee's very unique life experience. So hold on, and we'll be right back, y'all. Hey, y'all, welcome back from the break. So before we went to the break, we were talking with Charity Lee, and she was sharing with us the crises of her mother being charged with murder for hire, to have her father murdered. I should be clear, her mother was acquitted of the crime. We talked a little bit about their relationship and all that had ensued over that time. But in this segment, we want to transition to something a little bit different, as if that wasn't enough for one person to endure. Fast forward, Charity, you had a son on this one particular evening at the age of 13, Paris, and your lovely 4-year-old daughter, Ella. And can you just share with the viewers what happened on this particular night?
Yeah, it was February 4th, 2007. And I left. It was Super Bowl Sunday. I'll never forget. I hate football. Yeah, I had left to go to work, and I had a babysitter, at the house. She was supposed to stay until midnight. Around 9:30 that evening, Paris convinced the babysitter that it would be okay for her to go home, that he could take care of Ella. And by 10:30, maybe 11 o'clock that night, Ella had been sexually assaulted and murdered by Paris,
By her brother.
by her brother.
And according to the records, and in fact it is on your foundation as well, this is nothing that's hidden, but it was a violent act. It was a violent crime, wasn't it?
Yes, Paris started by beating Ella. He told me later that he wanted her to know who was hurting her. And then he attempted to choke her to death. But again, he told me later that she wasn't dying fast enough and that he wanted to put her out of her misery. So he stabbed her 17 times.
17 times.
Yes, and according to the autopsy report, the majority of Ella's stab wounds were not fatal, which means essentially that she was tortured
Yes.
first, and the final 2 or 3 were fatal. And they know this based on blood spray.
Sure. Forensics and all. Sure. First of all, I am so sorry. As a mother, I can't imagine. My heart goes out to you. When I read your story, it just made me weep. But there is so much good that is coming out of this, and that's what we are here to talk about today. So can you talk a little bit about your experience that night and the next few months as the mother of a murderer and the mother of the murdered?
It was an absolutely horrible experience. I had very little support. I had some support, but I had very little support from the community. The police certainly were not kind at first. And it's been my experience in the almost 6 years that this has happened, that whenever a murder occurs, families are treated like criminals, not victims.
The families of the victims are treated like criminals themselves.
A lot of times, yes. Quite often, yes. Because
Clearly that
everybody
needs to
assumes-
stop.
Yeah, everybody assumes, especially when it's a child that commits a crime, everybody assumes that if your child commits a crime, then obviously there's something wrong with parenting.
And why wouldn't people think, I think, mental illness? That's the first thing that would come to my mind. We certainly don't raise our children to be murderers. And you have been a hands-on mother, an excellent mother. And so I would think a sickness within the child. And this was in Abilene, Texas. Is this correct?
Abilene, Texas.
And so, you weren't handled up to par. You weren't given the support that you were, the respect, the love. How about compassion? And so you take this and you want to turn this around. What about Paris in prison? So he's incarcerated as a youth. When he goes away, is there some sort of support for him? Psychological evaluations, counseling, any guidance, any therapy that he's receiving at all?
Well, now, the youth department, they do provide some semblance of therapy. And now the quality of care is what I take issue with.
What was Paris's experience?
Right.
As soon as he was incarcerated.
Right. So the process for Paris was as soon as he was sentenced, he was sent to the state youth authority, and they have a processing center, just like in the adult system. And in this processing center, you would think that because in Texas and the youth authority now, they're only felonies. They're only felons. There's no misdemeanors or anything like that. So it's all felons. So we're talking rapes, murders, child sexual abuse, all felonies.
Violent crimes.
Violent crimes. Tragic, traumatic crimes. My son had never been in trouble with the police before. We had no history with Child Protective Services. We were well off. He was well educated, popular, no behavior problems. One would think that they would look at him and say, something must not be right here.
Right, exactly.
But they didn't. They gave Paris an IQ test and determined that he's a genius with an IQ of 100 and it's 141 or 142.
Oh, incredible.
And they gave him a physical, and they gave him a diagnosis of conduct disorder.
Simply from an IQ test and a physical.
Well, the conduct disorder diagnosis was based on the fact that he sexually assaulted, beat, and murdered his little sister. That got him conduct disorder. Now, conduct disorder can range from anything to skipping school to doing what Paris did to his sister. And there's a reason for this for children under 18. They don't really need a permanent label, which is fine with me. Don't give them a permanent label, but still try to find out what's wrong with them. You don't have to assign them a label. You can do a test and not say, oh, this is who you are. But you at least need something to have more information.
No psych evaluation.
Not at first.
No,
No.
assessment of sexual deviance.
None of that at first. I lawyered up after about a year
Okay.
and got a doctor in there. My concern was as soon as Paris was sentenced, the psychologist that was hired by the defense to assess Paris, for his competency, called me as soon as Paris was sentenced. And he essentially told me I could not speak to you while I technically worked for your child. But now that your child has been sentenced, I feel ethically right. I know he couldn't talk to me, his mother. I'm paying his bill, but he couldn't talk to his mother about what happened to my son. Wow. But he told me that he felt ethically obligated to inform me that even though my child was too young to formally diagnose as such, because he hadn't even turned 14 yet before he got sent to the, he was still 13, that although he was too young to formally diagnose as such, that he very, very strongly believed that my son is a psychopath, that the youth authorities would have no idea how to identify him, would not be able to help him, and that I needed to know this for my own safety. And this was coming from the doctor that I was not going to believe that about my son. And then I did a little bit more research on the man, and I found out that he's one of the leading experts in Texas in juvenile sociopathy. And so that kind of spurred one part of my personal quest. But what turned me into an advocate, two things turned me into an advocate. One, I swore to God and Ella that when they brought her body out that night, I swore to her, to God, to anybody that would listen, that I was going to make her death meaningful. She was not going to die for nothing.
And if I may say, that's exactly what you've been doing, and you have touched and changed and affected the lives of thousands of people in this nation because of the work that you're doing, because of your heart, your passion, your commitment, and your compassion.
That's all Ella. Not like the foundation. That's all Ella. I just try to act in a way that I think would make my daughter proud of me, because I do not want her death to have been in vain.
And I'm sure she's smiling down from heaven right now, very proud of you and the work that you're doing.
Hopefully. And the second thing that drove me to become an advocate was Paris. Everybody is always like, oh, you're so selfless. I'm not. My reasons for doing the work I do are completely selfish. I made a promise to my daughter that I am not going to break. And a month after my son was arrested, there was this huge story in the paper in Texas that the youth authority there, the Texas Youth Authority is what they used to be called, Texas Youth Commission is what they used to be called, had, the feds had been investigating them for a couple of years, and a month after Ella's murder, the feds put the juvenile system in Texas under federal indictment for the physical, sexual abuse of kids in their care, along with the fact that they weren't meeting federal jail standards, kids weren't getting an education like they were supposed to, And honestly, that just really pissed me off.
And you said feces on the wall in some circumstances. Many of these children are already coming from abusive situations that have been carried down from generation to generation, only to be incarcerated and to yet be on the receiving end of more abuse.
Who are out there in public saying they're public servants and that they're here to help my child and rehabilitate him. You're going to rehabilitate him by raping him? As far as I know, my kid was a virgin. You know? So I saw that in the paper and became livid, and it probably saved my life. Because if I had not gotten angry at the system, all that rage I felt towards Paris, I'm sure I would have taken out on me even worse than I did. Because I would not take it out on my son. I've lost my, I've yelled at him before, but I've not, I didn't
Gone ballistic on him.
Yeah, I didn't go ballistic on him.
So, what are some of the changes that have taken place in the youth incarceration system there in Texas?
They supposedly have completely reformed, and everybody, like even as recently as 3 months ago, the New York Times wrote up a little editorial about, oh, look how Texas has changed, and other states should follow their juvenile justice reform model. Well, if you go, Google them now, the latest story is everybody's all in an uproar again, because the problem now is instead of staff on youth assaults, essentially, with all of the sensitivity training, it's kind of gone the other way. And now quote, the inmates are running the asylum. There is a big controversy right now because they found out that at the facility where my son is, that students have been, bartering sex for food, contraband. I mean, it's just like, I call it big boy prison. It's just like big boy prison.
Sure.
Only it's younger kids. And there's been a lot of youth on youth assaults. And so now the whole system's under investigation again. As to if you knew that these youths were assaulting other youths, why weren't criminal investigations started? Why weren't they brought up on charges? Right. But it's had a very disturbing ripple effect because, one of the reforms was they got all the misdemeanor kids out and they kept just the felony children. And so now what I anticipate will happen is, in Texas, a child has to be 14 years old to be certified as an adult. If you commit a crime after the age of 14, they can certify you as an adult and put you in an adult prison.
14. Oh, my.
Yes.
That's a child.
Oh, yes. And children, and this is, I know numbers for Texas, but this is the case in all states that send juveniles to adult prisons. Children, who go to jail when they're 13, 14, 15 years old, their chances of being raped, beaten, assaulted, and not necessarily by other inmates, by guards,
sure,
increases exponentially because they are too little and not, intellectually savvy enough yet to outfox some of these extremely dangerous people in adult prisons.
Sure. That's just a shame.
Yeah.
And so the Ella Foundation was founded.
Yes.
And you have been a very aggressive and effective advocate for both the victims, but especially those who have somewhat fallen victim to the prison system as inmates. Share with us some of the knowledge that you have of the circumstances, the inhumane treatment that's taking place.
I do some direct work with, quote, offenders, but most of the work that I do is with their families. And the stories, I've heard, okay, let's see. I have a lady in Washington, D.C., who, she's an attorney. She's actually a juvenile defense attorney, surprisingly. But she is a juvenile defense attorney. Her son was arrested for child pornography on the computer. Not for actual sexual abuse of a child, but for the possession of child pornography. Right. So it makes it a federal offense. guards are not supposed to share, charges with
Right.
the other inmates, but there's always a way that it gets out. Her son was being transported from the fifth or sixth floor of a federal penitentiary down to the first floor for something. Two guards came, got him, put him in handcuffs, and instead of taking the elevator, they went to the stairs and they pushed him down the stairs and said that he tripped. And her son, has this big concussion. And the only reason that they did that is because he is, as a possessor of child pornography, he is scum in the eyes of everybody in prison.
Sure, of
Right.
course.
But you hear these horrible stories about solitary confinement. I mean, death row is nothing but one long solitary confinement. Maximum security, a lot of people don't realize, is pretty much solitary confinement. We have increased use of these supermax prisons. We are just housing people worse than animals. Now, see,
Not rehabilitating them.
no, not rehabilitating them, not helping them at all. There's too many. I mean, one of the biggest problems is that there's just too many people in prison that should not be in prison.
Right. It is overpopulated, and that has been an issue that's been in the press in the last 5 to 7 years, especially.
Right. So there's too many, and there's this general lack of care and concern for these people
And their families.
and their families. That's kind of like, you get guilt by association when you're
Sure.
a family member of a criminal.
But now you went on to get your national certification as a victim advocate, didn't you?
Yes, that's one of the things that I did. I kind of, for the Ella Foundation was officially incorporated a little over a year ago. But I've been doing, the work since a month after Paris's arrest. And the reason that I started the Ella Foundation is because I would work with these groups that were all about helping victims, but they hated offenders.
Right.
They wanted them all to burn horribly, painfully. Or I would work with these offender advocacy groups, and I didn't feel like they had enough concern, for what the victims were going through. All these, people, his Miranda rights weren't read to him. Okay, I understand the need for the Miranda rights and that make sure that we all have our civil rights protected.
Yes.
But Mama, your son ripped her throat out. Like, let's have a little balance. And
Right.
so I couldn't find an organization that struck that right tone. Everybody was too angry for me. For the, they were.
And the Ella Foundation walks a fine line because you actually service the needs of those on both sides.
I do both sides.
Because there are victims on both sides, as you know, because this is a life that you've walked. And this is a walk that we have not walked. Many of us have not.
I mean, I do as a crisis interventionist with the San Antonio Police Department, one of the populations that I would work with a lot were battered women. We go to a lot of domestic violence calls.
Good for you.
And, I would attempt to teach the victim of the battering that, there's something called a cycle of violence that goes on in an abusive relationship. Everything's great. The tension starts to build. You have the explosion. You've got your little honeymoon period. And it's just this vicious cycle. Now, every battered woman, after she's been hit the second time, can verify that cycle for you. And so what I tell people in my presentations is, there are no sides when it comes to violent crime. You're either in the circle or you're outside of it because you haven't been affected by it yet. But as soon as violence comes into your life, you're in the circle and you're with us whether you like it or not. And there are no sides. It is just, these men and women that commit crimes, the majority of them are just human beings who have made bad choices or had bad things happen to them that they didn't react well to, or they were out of their mind on drugs, or they have legitimate mental disorders.
Illness. Sure.
I mean, they're not, every single person that is sitting in prison even the ones that are violent, are not these horrible evil monsters with tails running around, like
Right.
conspiring to bring all nothing but evil into the world. They're human beings who are in bad situations and have done bad things. So they struggle with their feelings. They struggle with what they've done. The collateral damage of these crimes is so extreme. I see that the criminal justice system's role in justice should be to bring about, it shouldn't be about making more victims. You see kids who don't get to talk to their parents. I have a friend who in Mississippi whose son was executed by Mississippi in March. He was on Mississippi's death row for 16 years. In that 16 years, she never was able to touch her child. He was brought out to see her in arm and leg shackles, handcuffed to a table behind bulletproof glass, and had to talk to her on a telephone. Now, what is the likelihood that that guy would have murdered his mama in jail? But people are like, he doesn't deserve to touch his mama. Well, what about what his mama deserves?
What about her? What about what she needs?
And then, to add insult to injury, when it came time for his execution, she had to plan his funeral 2 weeks before his execution. She is a mother who had to plan her child's funeral while her child was still breathing.
That's just a shame. Well, I know there are people who are watching this right now, Charity, who you really struck a chord with them. Maybe they have a loved one or somebody that they know that has been committed a violent crime and is in the prison system, but they can relate to the fact that the loved ones have needs too, and where's the compassion for them? What is it that you can tell our viewers about the work that the Ella Foundation is doing and how they can partner with you and the Ella Foundation to make an impact?
Well, right now I've taken on this rather ambitious project of moving to Mississippi and doing my best to contact the family of every single person sitting on death row right now, which it was 51, but now it's 50. One gentleman had his sentence commuted because he is mentally disabled, deficient. I don't know what the politically correct word is anymore. And so now there's 50. So I'm attempting to get in touch with the family members, loved ones, and supporters of all the gentlemen, and there's 2 women on Mississippi's death row, and to track down the families of those who have been executed by the state of Mississippi, and whatever families want to get in touch with me who have people serving time in Mississippi prisons, and with the goal being to train them to become an advocate.
Okay, and they can contact you if they go to the ellafoundation.com?
Yes.
The contact information is there?
Yes. And so it's the Ella Foundation, or it's just simple charity at the ellafoundation.com for an email.
Charity at the ellafoundation.com for the email. Okay, great. Well, Charity Lee, I thank you so much for taking the time to come on. And I should mention, too, that Charity is available to be booked for public speaking engagements at your next conference for human rights, victims advocacy groups, whatever organization that you have. If you think that this is a good fit and you are interested in booking Charity Lee, please contact her or the foundation and talk schedules, and let's see if we can't get your message out there even more, huh?
I'm quite the speaker, from what I've been told.
Absolutely. You speak from the heart, and I love that, and you're a woman of passion.
I like to speak, I like the public speaking. I like to sit in front of a crowd, and I like to know that they've walked away from hearing my story, and you can tell that they're at least thinking.
Yes.
Thinking.
That's right, yeah.
I don't have
out
to,
of the box.
Yeah, I don't have to change everybody's minds. I just want them to see that all
Another
these people
perspective.
are people.
Yes, that's right. Well, Charity Lee of the Ella Foundation, thank you so much for
you.
joining us here on Solminod. I hope that we'll be able to follow up with you in a year or so and have you on the show again and talk about the work that's taken place since this meeting. Well, thank you so much, Charity. I've so enjoyed our time today talking, and I look forward to having you on again in the future to talk about all that's taken place since our meeting here today. And for those of you who are watching the show, you can also go to solminod.com, and we will have Charity Lee's contact information on there if you are interested in having her booked, or if you're looking for any other information, how you can lock arms with the Ella Foundation. So thanks, y'all, for tuning into Solminod. We hope that you will be blessed in whatever you put your hands to do. And remember to inhale love so you too can exhale compassion. For now, ciao.